Hello, my dears. My name is Mateusz Tarwacki, Zawieszony.pl, and this is TellTellingCinema, a podcast in which we talk about cinema and not only, because sometimes cinema is just a starting point for a conversation on various cinema-related matters. As you know, or at least most of you know, the 93rd Academy Awards Gala took place a few days ago. The event was special, not only due to the pandemic, the gala was moved from February to April, not only due to the fact that it included not only films from 2020 but also films from the beginning of 2021, not only because it was a closed gala held largely online, but also because it was an edition that went down in history as the edition with the largest number of nominations for women, as many as 70. An edition during which, for the first time in history of the award, an Asian woman, Chloe Zhao, won the Best Picture award for Nomadland. However, I will not restrain myself and my need to express my point of view, of course, because I have to admit my personal disgust towards various gala events and awards in general, and especially for the glitz of the Oscars, which remind me somehow of the Catholic Church when it comes to the ossification of the Academy's structures, how much it is a closed institution. A few years ago, I do not know what it looks like now, maybe it is slowly changing, it's getting younger perhaps, but a few years back, the youngest member of the Academy was a 42 years old white male. Of course, this is an award that captures the spirit of the production system, the great capital that is inherent in great film productions. Looking at those red carpets, getting excited by the beauty of the famous smiling faces, safe gossipy pictures, and an effective énoncier, it's so easy to forget that this is not the whole movie world, that these are certain specific choices made by certain specific people. But on the other hand, of course, one should be aware of what I also admit. It is an award that has great visibility and still enjoys great prestige. In this respect, it is a great opinion making force. Therefore, while one may hate the award itself and the hypocritical halo around it, that empty shell, it is worth paying attention to the potential of visibility and the fact that perhaps something is slowly starting to break. Personally, I think that nothing will clean up the many years of inequality, the sins of the industry, but I would like to treat this year's award, this change taking place in front of our eyes, as a ray of hope and a tool. I try to operate from the level of a skeptical observer who keeps in mind that women's victory at this year's gala is undoubtedly a success, but it is not a given thing forever. This is something that will have to be fought for in the same way in the coming years. For a greater presence of authors and creators, women, racial and ethnic minorities. The last year could have been the year of the female Oscar winners, but it wasn't. I remember how much I counted on the presence of the portrait of a lady on fire by Celine Sciamma. The portrait was not shortlisted and Parasite had no competition whatsoever. Although, of course, as a film drawing attention to social inequalities, it was also an important picture. Oscars, being the Himalayas of mass culture, have a remarkable strength and visibility all over the world, so the mere presence of more women and awards for film created by women is a very important thing. But guess what? I have another matter suggested by one of my readers, who I thank very much for giving me the idea. This year, for the first time in the history of this award, disabled people appeared in the hall. Not the actors playing the role, like in the case of David Lynch's Elephant Man, with the memorable role of John Hurt, but people using wheelchairs to move around. The protagonists of the film by Nicole Newnham and James Lebrecht, Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, nominated for an Oscar in the documentary film category. Lebrecht, the film's director, is himself a wheelchair user. The movie is available for free on Netflix YouTube channel. As I thought about it while preparing for the subject, I was surprised by the level of my own ignorance. That I had to check how to talk about people with disabilities. I had to check if it is okay to talk about disabled people simply using the term disabled. Could it be better to use the term persons with disabilities? This is an extremely diversified world. That is, a world in which the range of various diseases, dysfunctions is enormous. The disability itself can be motor, mental, social. A disabled person can be a person with autism, a person with epilepsy, a person with rheumatic diseases after amputations, respiratory and circulatory system diseases. The multiplicity of these different categories is classified according to the degree and type, but also the internal hierarchy of the presence of disabled people in everyday social life. The matter which was discussed by the protagonists of Crip Camp. I tried then to find examples of films, not documentaries, but fictional films, in which a voice would be given to these people, at least in some extent. Let it not be a mere portray of disabled people, but a space for their history. Not necessarily mellow, not necessarily super sweet, but theirs. The problem of portraying disabled people is probably present since the first film in which disabled people appeared. Freaks, from 1932. Actors who appeared on the screen worked in the circus on a daily basis. And although the intentions of the creator, Todd Browning, were not hostile or were not meant to show these people as a kind of study of curiosities, on the contrary, this film was a bit ahead of its time, and it was not without reason that it received such great recognition later, in the 60s, when there was a boom for the cinema watched at midnight, the midnight movies. Movies that were supposed to move sensitive strings, that were supposed to shock, cause extreme reactions, rejection, disgust, things like that. Browning tried to make a film disturbing with images, a horror movie, but also he was showing a kind of solidarity of people with disabilities, showing their bodies, their desires, emotions, regardless of how we read the film today, whether as an offensive thing or as the first presence, the message, we are human, we are among you. It is precisely the presence of emotions that deserves attention. After all, people with disabilities are subject to the same rules of being human, just as the rest of the society. They want to love, they feel anger, joy, hatred, they are driven by fear, desire for revenge, etc. Rather, the problem is in depicting these people. Perhaps it could not have been otherwise then, but Freaks set a certain standard for showing disabled people as people in a specific environment, the margins, the circus, outside the society. The category of a cabinet of curiosities, unintentionally present in Browning's film, lingers in the contemporary cinema with the way of presenting disabled people. Let's skip their function in the film. Let's skip the fact that people with dwarfism played dwarfs in fairy tales, in Snow White or Willow from 88, and their possible movie careers were limited to this function. A function, one can say ironically, which has evolved and reached its climax in the role of Tyrion in Game of Thrones. But precisely, the presence of dwarfism on the screen does not do well for the entire minority, for the entire social group. This is an industry accepted visual key, regardless of whether it is a decent role or not. It familiarizes the viewer with this particular condition only. Does it help all disabled people and their visibility? Probably not. When various diseases appear on the screen, they are to have specific effects. They are either to disturb or jerk tears, lead the viewer to catharsis, purification of negative emotions, or they are to be something that I call Christian mush, that is, sweet vision of a world where disease and suffering are uplifting and take this man to a higher spiritual level, or some fairy tale about compassion, love of neighbor and acceptance, etc., etc. David Lynch's Elephant Man from 1980, which I mentioned earlier, gives me mixed feelings. It was, of course, a display of John Hurt's acting talent and an emotional journey of compassion for the viewer, but, as it happens with Lynch, the image of the Elephant Man also served to build tension based on the anxiety of commuting with otherness. In this respect, this film is very close to Browning's Freaks. A glowing example is Wonder from 2017, a film about a boy with a deformed face who has a problem with adjusting to society and finding a place among his peers. The boy finds enormous support in his loving parents, building a candy sympathetic fairy tale world for him. Parents played by Julia Roberts and Owen Wilson. Julia Roberts, whose roles in terms of romantic vision of the character have not changed in years. Or Intouchables from 2011, about the class breaking friendship of a wealthy white man using a wheelchair with a black suburban boy. Yes, of course, a story that traces the true story, but again, with candy notes. There is 1 in a million chance that a disabled person will have an equal chance because of their financial status. This is again not a representative picture. Alternatively, we have documentaries that draw attention to this hardship and toil, movies that show everyday functioning on the margins in a bubble, that show the invisibility of disabled people in society. For example, the 2005 Murder Ball, which is about a team of disabled rugby players. A sports film with the familiar sporty tension, but showing the world of disabled sportsmen. But all these movies lack a stronger cinematic representation of disabled people. This lack results from their absence in our everyday social life, with virtually no idea of how a person can lead this so-called normal life with so-called normal feelings, needs and desires. It is hard to stop using cliches and showing this social group from a safe distance. I would like to show a few examples that would indicate, perhaps also here, a slowly occurring social change in the search for new ways of showing disability or discovering a bit of this world on equal terms, not from a distance. One such film is the 2018 Swedish Border by Ali Abbasi, a fantasy story about a border officer who is a lady troll. A story about otherness that can afford much more, precisely because it uses the key of fantasy. It's able to indulge in the excitement and the beautiful, naturalistic, and different scene of sex between the trolls precisely because it is a story told under the cloak of fantasy. But this is a story that shows that every human being has access to this kind of emotionality, to ordinary needs. Most of us feel the need for closeness, and people with disabilities are no exception. It is also a story about learning to function in a very difficult world that pushes otherness to the margins. Another film, also Swedish, that uses fantasy tools is Johannes Nyholm's Giant from 2016. The director, who you may also know from the great art house psychological horror Cocody Cocoda from 2 years ago. Giant tells the story of Ricard, an autistic man with a severely deformed body. On the one hand, it is an attempt to show a complicated perspective of a person living in his own world, a complicated, sensitive emotionality, and on the other hand, it is never-ending clash with social ostracism. It is a film in which Ricard's imaginary world accustoms the viewers to his sensitivity, maybe sometimes falling into the trap of sad fairy tale, but nevertheless successful. Another interesting look is Adina Pintil's Touch Me Not from 2018, and the figure of Christian, a person using a wheelchair who, despite the limitation of mobility caused by the disease, is a person who uses and explores his libido, his body, and sexual needs. This is one of the rare cases where we have at least an attempt to show a disabled person's perspective. An attempt, because I'm still not convinced if it was a successful experiment. On the other hand, it is certainly a difficult film that encourages the viewer to think heavily and therapeutically about one's own body. But this is one of the rare examples of a movie where we actually have a disabled person's sexuality on the screen, presented not as disturbing, disgusting, but as something absolutely normal. It provokes not horror, but awkwardness, a shame from dealing with basically ordinary corporeality on the screen. In the document from which we started, Creep Camp, by Nicole Newnham and James Lebrecht, there is also such a normalizing ordinary perspective. The film tells the story of a little-known page in the history of the hippie movement, a revolutionary part of the movement created by people with disabilities, which led to the relaxation of legal provisions that made life difficult for disabled people in the States and de facto eliminating their presence from social life. The movement had its roots in a camp for teenagers with disabilities located right in front of the famous Woodstock Festival. In the 70s, this movement led to the fact that public space was better adapted to the presence of disabled people. Their presence was noticed by state authorities and by law. What drives me crazy in most American documentaries, talking heads cut through with pictures from private family archives, the perspective from the family cell level, works surprisingly well in the case of Crip Camp. It is a demonstration that the protagonists of the film lead an ordinary life. To what extent the state supports people with disabilities, not only in the United States, may be a separate question. But at least the people in the documentary have families, children, and can lead a normal sex life. One of the protagonists tells about one of the crisis moments in her life, where, thinking about the fact that she will soon die, she had sex with a bus driver because she did not want to die as a virgin, where her doctor asked her the question, who would want to fuck you? Without understanding, generally speaking, that she is a person. In all those portraits of disabled people, which are to make the viewer either anxious or bitter or cathartic, or to show a story that is to fill the viewer with faith, I don't know, in God, in man, etc. These simple examples are really refreshing. because they show how artificial the category of normal living is. Because who created the frames of our social life? Who decides that some can participate in public life and others not? Law, education, government? Nobody. Nobody but us. How unnatural then the social inequalities seem. I think part of the fight for a truly equal, open, tolerant society where everyone has the right to feel at home is the fight for visibility. Visibility of the minorities, showing injustice and trying to break it. That is why I think that even those bad tools, for example, big box office awards, can be used as lockpicks to open simply the world, to get the message across to more people. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the topic. If you would like me to do something specific, have an idea, would like to hear about something, I constantly encourage you to contact me via my website or social media. I will leave the links in the podcast description. Until next time, in TellTellingCinema.